Welcome to our Keys to Unlocking Educational Success webinar series dedicated to transforming education so that more children can be successful readers and learners. And today we have Jean Schedler, an experienced Orton Gillingham fellow and educator, master teacher, to share with us her background and knowledge on the topic of comprehension. So welcome, Jean. How are you today?
Well, welcome. Thank you. Thank you, Teresa.
Well, we're excited to have you, Jean. And I thought maybe just to begin, we could just take a minute so that our listeners could hear how you got into this field of education and your areas of expertise in reading.
I started as a classroom teacher, and it was elementary, second grade, and was just absolutely fascinated with how children learn to read. And I really wanted to focus on that and enable children to be successful in reading. And it was right about that time that we began to examine and the word dyslexia began to come out. And I always thought those would be the most interesting children to work with. And so I began to pursue degrees and working with students that struggle in terms of dyslexia. So I've worked with students. I went on and became a teacher trainer and continue to do both work with students and work with teachers in enabling both the teachers and the students to be the best they can be.
Thank you. And you know, Jean, I know you've, like you were sharing, you've been both a teacher and a teacher's teacher, and have a lot of information on the different elements needed to teach reading. But today our main topic is comprehension. And what is comprehension? Let's just start there so that our listeners, what is comprehension? What does reading comprehension mean?
Well, reading comprehension is the constructing meaning from printed words. If we're talking about reading comprehension, it is when the reader constructs meaning from the words on the page. I was really pleased. I just want to back up a little on the National Reading Panel when we actually came out with what are the effective elements or necessary elements in a reading lesson. And comprehension is but one of 5. It is probably the gold star, the one that we all are really focused on and is really important. But it is the success of one's ability to comprehend connected text is directly built upon their ability to do all the other 4 elements in the reading lesson as well.
Right. And I appreciate you saying that, because really for this webinar series dedicated to the topic of reading, we've had speakers on each one of these essential elements that really are necessary before you can get to comprehension. But I remember in my children's time, when they were in school, everything was focused on comprehension without making sure that those other elements were soundly in place. So if a child wasn't comprehending, they might think, oh, they're just not paying attention or they're not interested, but no one was checking out whether they could decode the words properly or even had the vocabulary and all those features. So what did you see when you were teaching in the schools? Because I know you taught both dyslexic learners and non-dyslexic students. What did you see in your early career in teaching when it came to comprehension? What was that orientation?
Well, the orientation was, and if we actually go back and take a look at it, we really didn't know how to teach comprehension. We didn't know how the brain learned to read, which is a rather current human invention, and everyone must be taught. And so we basically, when I was in the classroom teacher, we basically tested for it. In other words, read this passage, tell me what the main idea is. And if the child was not able to give the main idea, all we did was wrong. This is the main idea. Now read this paragraph and tell me what the main idea was. We had no strategies and skills to help the child determine what the main idea was, other than if it wasn't the first sentence in the paragraph or the last sentence, then we didn't have any skills and strategies. We weren't taught. And so we basically tested for comprehension and their understanding, but we never could teach it. And now we actually know how to build a reading brain, and we actually know how to teach comprehension.
Okay, so just to back up and highlight this for our parents and teachers that are listening, I'm going to try to say this back just to make sure I'm comprehending you correctly. The comprehension has to do with the meaning and understanding attached to the printed word, what we walk away with, our understanding of what we just read. I know in my time when I worked with students, there were children who could read, and then you ask them what did they just read or ask them questions. They could decode the words, but they did not have an understanding of what they just read. It just kind of fell away. So comprehension has to do with the meaning and understanding that one has after reading a passage, right? After decoding the text.
Well, there's been a shift. We used to say that comprehension was bringing meaning to text. And now we're using the verb. We changed the verb in the last 3 to 5 years from bringing meaning to text to constructing meaning. So it is the reader's job to construct meaning. And then the question is, does he have the tools in order to construct the meaning? Which then you're talking about decoding vocabulary. As the children get older, do they only know the first meaning of a word? Do they know the more subtle second and third meaning? Have they had life experiences? All those kinds of things. And then we actually are able to look at the learner and their ability to construct the meaning and what tools do they have to construct that meaning.
Right.
So it's
it's complicated, right? So even if you take the topic, let's say fluency, if a child can they're so slow, they're breaking down the words like the cat, but they're reading so slowly that they can't remember the cat sat on the mat to get the image of a cat sitting on a mat. Their fluency is halted and so slow they can't construct the meaning. So there's many different elements, like you said, that may be slowing down the ability to construct that meaning. And so the teacher's job or the parent's job is to try to figure out where it's breaking down, right? Where that is not working.
Right. It's also the tools, which is the skills, and then there's the process of putting it all together. And that sometimes is strategies. So do they have the tools, and in this case, the student with the fluency problem, fluency is accuracy plus rate. They need both the accuracy and the rate in order to be fluent. So you have to say, are they compromised in their accuracy? Are they compromised in their rate? Are they compromised in putting the two together? And that's a tool. And then can they apply it? How long is the sentence? Do they become weary? Do they not have endurance just to read the longer sentences? Right. So you have to go back and forth and look at it as tools and then process.
Okay, so if we take this idea that comprehension is this construction of meaning, how do you rake through this then? What are the things that you look for as a teacher, or how are you teaching teachers to then teach comprehension? What do you recommend are the necessary awarenesses or steps?
Well, the first piece is I always like to begin at the beginning, and I always like to begin positive. Like instead of focusing on what is the student not able to do, I want to ask the teachers to tell me what is the student able to do, at what is he successful. And in terms of comprehension, begin at the beginning is to actually start with oral comprehension. There's oral comprehension, reading comprehension, written comprehension, oral and written comprehension. In the oral comprehension, we have to be sure that they can comprehend oral language before we ever put the challenge of print in front of them, which is a higher level of comprehension.
I really love that you're saying that, because I think for most of our listeners, maybe it comes as a surprise. So many elements in the reading process really starts at the oral level, right? So can you explain then what you mean by making sure that a child or student is comprehending at the oral level. Give some examples of what what to look for there.
Oftentimes, oral language, we confound articulation, the child's ability to speak accurately, produce the sounds accurately. Now, speech articulation is separate from oral comprehension.
Right.
And a child can have speech articulation issues without it compromising their oral comprehension. And speech language pathologists basically can address both issues. So I'm not talking about speech articulation problems that can compromise oral comprehension, but I'm not talking about the speech articulation problems. I'm only talking about the child's ability to understand receptively and expressively oral comprehension. So to understand receptive oral comprehension is someone else is doing the speaking and the child is doing the listening and comprehending. And so if you're able to give directions to your child and he follows those directions, he is receptively understanding oral language.
So would that be like if you said to your child, I want you to go to your room and pick up your jacket and bring it here, and also on the way will you pick up my purse and bring that down to me, and oh hey, don't forget your little brother's shoes. So you're giving these series of directions, right? And you're trying to see what can they hold on to, what can they remember, what are they comprehending with the request? Is that an example?
No, because now you've involved working memory.
Right.
How many directions can they hold in their working memory is putting something in your active memory, in your short-term memory, and then doing something with it.
Right.
It's to begin at the beginning would be simply pick up the purple crayon and see if they're able to know what pick up means and then know what the color purple is. Or even as simple as, would you like another cookie or more milk? Those are some of the beginning pieces, and the child's able to answer simple, without words even, just nodding. So that's receptive, is when the child's able to respond without words. That's really the most basic. And they do that in the early reading books. Point to the red ball, point to the, big dog, point to the small dog, where is Waldo, those kinds of things. Yeah, that's receptive. You're doing the talking and the child is simply doing the action.
Okay, and you're saying just one action so that if you compound it and they don't do that, maybe that is a memory issue to hold the several directions, but give one direction and see if they're comprehending. But then but also when they asking them questions, I know at the end of the day, a lot of parents may experience, well, how was your day? Fine. Like you're just not going to get response. Can you describe that piece?
Well, when we go into expressive language, it's a child that's when he begins to be able to, he's the one using the words to describe or tell. With your specific example of your question, we want to usually ask a question. If you really want to know what the child's day was like, you want to format your question so he can't answer it with a one-word answer. So that would be something like, tell me what was the most favorite thing you did today? And then tell me more. Why was that your most favorite thing? Those kinds of things that they can't answer with one. But expressive language then is when the child shares he initiates the language or engages in two-person conversation. And then oral language we want to look at, is it just one-word answers? Is it just 2 to 3 words? Is he able to answer in 5 words? What's his sentence construction? Parents can sort of go to the playground and listen to same age children and their conversation with other children. And you can usually say, gosh, that 6-year-old is speaking in, just a sense that their sentences are longer and more interesting. We go 3 to 5 word sentences, 5 to 7 word sentences, but that's the clinical look. But a parent can just go to the playground and know that another child is speaking longer and more interesting than my child who just watches and gives one-word answers.
Right. I know my youngest son really struggled with language issues, and if he generated the topic, it might be a string of expressions and words, tumbling out. But if I asked the question and he had to organize it, that's where it would start to fall apart. And it took me a while to notice it, because as a parent, even myself or his brother would fill in for him. So we weren't really aware how much he was struggling with using expressive language. It had to be pointed out to us, and then we had to kind of ask questions, sit back and listen, and just see how he was using language. And we could see there was a gap between where he was and his age, his age peers.
Yes.
So it took us a while to see that. And then it took me as a parent a while to realize that I was asking too big a question. I had to break it down. Tell me the one thing that you like best about today, or, what was one thing in your lunch that you like? I had to really break it down for him. And once we started to do that, that helped him. And the expression we used was, it helped him to learn to speak in a straight line, because he would when he spoke, he wouldn't stay in a straight line. So there were exercises we could do to help him build his receptive and expressive oral language use. Now, so you're saying that reading comprehension is built upon this platform of oral language, is that correct?
Yes, it's oral language underpinnings of reading comprehension. That's the phrase. What are the oral language underpinnings for reading comprehension?
All right.
And we have to be aware of those. And what's really nice about the internet is if you go on any speech and language or ASHA or any of those, or just Google scope and sequence for oral language development, or a sequence of oral language development, it'll just pop right up, and it'll say by age 3, the child should be doing this. By age 5, the child should be doing this. And parents, like, even, if once the children are in a group, I always say your antennas wiggle when you realize that your child is very verbose, very conversational compared to his age mates, or reticent compared to his age mates. Parents are a good gauge of their kids, and I always respect and listen very closely to my parents when we work with our children.
Right. The only thing is, sometimes, Jean, some of these speech language issues could be hereditary, right? So you have to make sure that the parent has those. So the parent has to be aware themselves of their receptive and expressive language. And teachers have to their antenna has to go up and be aware of all the students in their room and try to gauge what's going on. Because I know sometimes it's very hard for a parent to get speech language services, because so often, for example, with my son, we knew he was a delayed speaker. And when we would go and get him evaluated, they said, oh, no, he's fine. And he was really delayed. I mean, I'm talking, he was like 3 years old before he started to speak. And so what really was happening when he was being tested for speech language, they were testing for articulation. Like, was he saying his R's right and his sounds right? But that is not what we were talking about. And that is not what they were properly evaluating him for. I think they were so short-handed with speech pathologists that they really targeted the big issues of articulation without looking at these more subtle but powerful issues of expressive and receptive language use. They frankly weren't on board with that. So I'm just putting that out there as a possibility.
I think there's now my grandson's been getting services, and early child find is
right.
significant. It's out there. So if you think of something, look at early child find. And I think the speech pathologist field has really grown and embraced and excited about the oral language underpinnings involved in reading.
Good.
Yes, very much so.
Good.
Yes.
So that's something for both the parent and teacher to be aware of, this oral language, as you're saying, the underpinnings that go into comprehension. What else to look at as the elements for comprehension?
We've spent a lot, Teresa, you and I have spent a long time on oral language. And I just want to, before we leave it, it's the length of the oral language. That's what, when I worked in the special needs school in terms of oral language underpinnings, the child presented expressively didn't, as a beginning teacher and as a reading expert kind of in the field, I had to really partner with a speech language pathologist to become better at identifying. And so one of the biggest things was, if you're asking a child to read a 3 to 5 word sentence, they should be speaking in 3 to 5 words. But once you tip over in the upper grades around 3rd grade and you're asking the child to read a 5 to 7 word sentence, read it. And they're still speaking in the shorter length sentences. The oral comprehension for the longer passages isn't there at the oral language. So of course, it's not going to be there when you introduce the print. And so as a clinician, I needed to go back and put in place longer oral language discourses with the child. And once we got in, and have him construct longer oral language discourse. Then when we went back to the connected print with the longer print sentences, they then were able to do that. So before we actually leave the oral language piece, I just want to say that it can present itself along the way. And whenever they would have a difficulty at the comprehension level of connected text, I would always go back and see what it looked like at the oral language level. Was it solid at the oral language level?
Right. Absolutely. No, I hear you. And it's something that is so important to highlight, because I think many times we just don't know these underpinnings. So it's what I'm hearing you say, that oral language piece has to parallel the strength and ability that you're asking them to read at, especially as you go up in grades, right?
Correct. Yes.
Okay.
And this is my message to the parents is, listen, you always say, what can I do to help my child? And what you can do to help your child is talk to your child. In other words, if you go on a family event or go on a trip kind of thing, we always want them writing in a journal, well, let's have them talk. Tell me about it. Can you tell me, make a picture in my mind, tell me a story about it so that I create a picture. Challenge your child to orally tell more interesting sentences, because if they're able to build longer and more interesting sentences and passages at the oral language level, when they encounter print, either in reading of connected text or writing, they're going to be able to do a better job because they have all those skills at the oral language level as well. So parents, talk to your children, joke, laugh, do similes, any of those language games, play with language, make it your friend, discover different meanings. And it's parents, you have just such a wonderful opportunity to have so much fun with your child with oral language.
And, that's such an important thing to highlight, Jean, in a time when we are plugged into social media, and children are plugged in, and families are sitting in a room together, and everybody's on their phone, and everybody's texting in short phrases, right? And the importance of being able to talk to each other is becoming a lost art. I know there was one family I heard of, they did what they called talking stick, and they would pass the stick, and whoever had the stick had to tell a story. And just the act and practice of that was so important.
Right. Yes. Yes. I mean, I know long family road trips in the car. Either I would read aloud a story when it got dark, or we played different kinds of games, or just the verbal banter and joy in it. And it was wonderful. And now everybody puts a movie on or puts a headset on. I was out to dinner and I looked over at this family, and they were out for dinner and everybody was on their device, and my heart just broke. I wanted to say, put down your devices, look at each other, talk to each other. This time is so short when you have them. They're just so precious. Talk to your children. Yeah.
You know, it's funny because you call them devices, and divisiveness, that division that can come from being in these separate worlds. And it's our language, our ability to speak, and our ability to even read someone else's reality and story that connects us. Otherwise, it is divisive. We are divided and separated. So I thank you for highlighting that. And what about, you were saying this creating the images. Can you talk a little bit more? For some children, I know it surprised me when I realized that sometimes we use our own filter. So for example, when I read, I see the images very easily, almost like a movie. As I'm reading, I am projecting these images in my mind. But I was surprised when I was working with children with language disabilities that some were not, they did not have the capacity to have those images, to see it, to smell it, to picture it in their mind. Can you speak to that facility? I know we use the Visualizing, Verbalizing, the Linda Mood Bell program to help our students be able to hold on to the meaning by seeing it deeper. Can you explain some of that?
That's a very exciting piece as we've unpacked comprehension, and we've actually began to look at how does the brain, how do we build a reading brain is what it's, we're constructing it all the time. And in the research and the science and the MRIs, we've discovered that, or learned that some children, like you said, they don't build a picture in their brain. And so when a word or something is done, there's no picture there. And when I was working in the classroom, didn't know anything about that. And so once it became possible to know about it, we now are able to, again, visualize and verbalizing, helping students learn how to build a picture in their brain. And we use language, and there's a structured process so as not to overwhelm the child in it. And we're able to make a difference with it. And that's a huge piece. It has nothing to do with intelligence. So, and it actually doesn't have anything to do with ability to decode connected text. It's the fact that a picture is not built as they decode the text.
Right.
And those are our most challenging students. Right. But I'm very excited that there is a process now and a program that actually is able to help them build pictures in their brain.
Right. We used to say to parents, with young children, it's such a valuable time to get children's books with beautiful pictures in them. And when you sit there and read the book to your child, you then have this beautiful imagery to have them look at and point to and learn the vocabulary of what's up and down and to the left and the colors, and start to just roam around these beautiful pictures to build understanding, imagery, and vocabulary, essentially. And so we would really encourage you, especially while they're young enough to sit on your lap and you have that chance, make sure it's not just books with text that you're reading, but books with beautiful imagery that you can look at and talk about and say, do you like that tree? What is it about that tree that you find special? And just try to work the pictures as well.
Yes. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what else? What's another piece to this with comprehension that a parent or teacher would need to try to evaluate or look at?
Well, once we, I'm glad we spent some time on the oral language piece of it, because that is the underrepresented piece. And
Right.
if parents are listening, this is really a key with the oral language, something that they can do that could make a significant difference in their child's life. We transition into how do we build a reading brain around comprehension. There's many movable parts in it that we begin to assemble, and the classroom teacher is pretty important in terms of assembling this. But each element is an element within itself, and it needs to be taught independent and then woven into the total picture of being able to comprehend. We begin with, if the child is, again, I'm going to move over into content area reading in terms of reading for school, for science, or social studies. And the teacher needs to begin by identifying what does the teacher want the students to know and understand after reading the text. So the teacher needs to establish what her goals are, what the outcome is. You start it with the end, actually, and then go back to the beginning. So when the students finished reading a chapter, a book, a passage, what do you want to know the student to know and understand after they've finished this unit, chapter, or story? So then once you've identified that, what are your outcomes? Then when the child goes to read, the teacher or parent needs to establish the purpose for reading the text. I want you to read this text to find out, or what is the joke, or how many rivers there are, or what was colonial life like, in the 1850s. You have to set a purpose. So the teacher needs the ability to set a purpose, and then the child reads for that purpose. And then you also have to then have a conversation about the purpose for reading. So there's the purpose for reading the unit, but there's also the purpose for reading the page.
Right. So, okay, so you set the meaning and the purpose of what you're hoping they'll extract. Sometimes one of the purpose may be, if it's literature, just the joy of reading, because sometimes the style of writing is so different, right? There's all these different genres.
Right.
So you're exposing a child to these different modes of writing, ways of writing. And some children will appreciate and just attach themselves to certain type of literature, and others maybe they like more factual, fact-based information, right? So it really varies. But a good teacher would teach a child to read, to know how to approach things to read, right? To gather that meaning.
Right. And we're not talking about independent reading. I mean, children don't need just, they're going to read their car magazine and they've already established the purpose. They're going to read the novel.
Right.
They've already established the purpose. We're not talking about independent reading for fun. We're talking about reading in order to learn and comprehend new material. Teachers don't establish the outcome and then are surprised when the children didn't. They need to help the children focus and determine the outcome, and then go back and begin it at the beginning, and then establish purpose for reading everything.
Right.
Another element that at the same time is the vocabulary. The teacher needs to go through and establish what is the vocabulary. And there's two levels of vocabulary. One level of vocabulary is content specific. I'm teaching math. And what is the specific math vocabulary that you need to learn in second grade or third grade, or 8th grade or 10th grade. And the other vocabulary is the vocabulary that's new to this lesson. Some of it is new that you're going to need next time. And some of it is new that you only need for this particular unit. And, you'll never run into it again necessarily.
Right.
So,
but
yes.
So,
and is it the meaning or the second meaning? That's most struggling readers get the first meaning of a word. And then when they get to 5th, 6th, and 8th grade, they don't know the second or more subtle meaning of the word. So vocabulary is just continually ongoing.
Right. And so important. And even to back up, let's just talk about decoding, because sometimes children maybe pass through and someone's thinking they're not comprehending, but they're actually not even decoding properly, right? So that they can't get to that. You want to address that?
Well, that's when I work with the high schools. I use the vocabulary to be able to get the high school content area teachers to go back and actually begin to look at the decoding component of it.
Right.
When you come up through the elementary grades, they often are already learning the decoding. And the piece is, 1st, 2nd grade teachers are usually the ones most skilled at teaching decoding. 3rd graders, teachers maybe less so. 4th, 5th, and 6th graders sort of assume. And our struggling readers, they're not really available sometimes to learn some of the higher level skills till they get to the higher level grades. Or the other piece is our young children, if they've suffered any kind of stress, any kind of disruption in the home life, we are finding that they're not available to learn in the early grades because they're dealing with stress, abuse, poor home lives, whatever. And so they may not be dyslexic, and they may not even be struggling readers. They simply weren't available to learn at the time that it was being taught. And that's not a reflection on the teacher or the methods or the product or the materials.
It's the reality.
Correct. And so we have to afford that child the opportunity to learn it, that even though that learn the decoding piece that he wasn't available for at an earlier age.
Well, Jean, I teach at the college level, and I've had students come in that are still on a 4th grade reading level, and they really can't use the material because they really haven't been able to decode properly. So I think a teacher can never assume what's behind the struggle. You have to break it down and look where the weakness is, where the weak link is.
Yes. And I like your word assume. One of the things that when I work with teachers at any grade is the word assumptions, is that we all, like we went into this broadcast for certain assumptions, thinking there'll be parents and teachers here. A teacher goes into teacher content area with various assumptions of prior knowledge or different pieces. And we all go into all learning environments with assumptions. And my biggest comment here is to try to be aware of your assumptions, because it is your assumptions often that are the weak spot in the piece. And so even working with upper grade teachers, if you 3rd grade, 6th grade, 8th grade, the student comes in and you have an assumption that they have a certain knowledge of underlying skills. And my suggestion always is do a quick review. Spend the first week of school doing a quick review of everything that you assume the student has. And it could take 5 minutes, and then you'll know that they have those skills, or you'll know which children might be lacking them, and get them up to speed quicker at the beginning of the year than waiting and have them continually fall through the thin ice repeatedly all year long.
Jeannie, I think that's so true. When I teach these college courses, I always do a review of how to approach the textbook. because even in graduate school, and many times the students will thank me, they'll say, nobody ever taught me how to approach this chapter or how to deal with these books and material, because I've just learned that most of the time someone will start at the first page in one of these heavy textbooks and try to read to the end and make it through maybe the first page, and then they're up getting a cup of coffee, or they got to make a phone call or clean their house or something, because they really just can't sit down and just start reading page after page of heavy text. They need to know how to do a review, how to pull the vocabulary, do it layered learning in order to approach this. So even college students, you can't assume that they do know how to approach textbooks. So I would say one of the questions we aim for in this webinar series is, what is the belief system or barrier that needs to be overcome? And I think on this topic of comprehension, then what you're highlighting is this assumption that everyone is sitting down ready to start comprehending. That is a huge assumption that is very worthy of relooking at, no matter what grade student you're working with. You know,
the other piece of it is, it's knowledge and skills, but there's also process. Like you said, how do you approach a book? That is a process. And the same thing with, how do we learn vocabulary? Some of the strategies, there's a process to the strategy, and we need to teach the strategy independent of teaching a challenging vocabulary word. So the child needs to learn the process and the strategy. In other words, how to use the tool before you actually have to use the tool in real life. I mean, I would rather learn how to use a drill on a practice piece of wood than putting a door into my brand new house.
Right.
And get it wrong.
As a great example, it's true. No one would even think of just grabbing a drill and going to do that. You'd have to practice and you'd have to be shown. And the same goes for all of these things, because the assumption was that if you were just motivated and interested, you could learn. And what we're finding out is that that assumption about why children are successful or not, based on their willingness, is incorrect. It has to do with their neurology. It has to do with their special brain architecture. You may have one student over here who can't decode. You may have another one over here who can't visualize. You could have another one over here who's weak with the oral language foundation. And I think most teachers and parents they're not aware to look at all of these different things, because they run it all through their filter. How was I as a learner? What worked for me? And you kind of assume that everyone's similar, right? Because we all, but it's not true. Every brain architecture is different. Every child is going to learn language best as they are and how they learn. And a teacher has a big job to figure out in their class of a lot of students, regardless of what grade, what's going on with each student to help them. And a parent may have multiple children or their own language issues. Same with the teacher, could have their own language issues, not even be aware of it. So all these things mix together and impact a child's learning, because it impacts how they're being taught. Do you have in your years here, Jean, of working with children and different schools, is there an example or some child that comes to mind, or a situation where you were able to kind of problem solve what was going on and take that child to a different level? Like, have you seen this in application? I know you have.
Right.
That's all you've done.
Well, this is a good segue into where we are now going in terms of our own professional learning as professionals, teachers and educators. And so the piece is that we now learn and work in what's called professional learning communities, PLCs. And so you come together and we take and all the expertise within a school, and you problem solve or strategy together as colleagues, where you respect each other and tap on each other's wisdom and experience in terms of so that you can learn together. And so often the workshops I now do with teachers are within the construct of building a professional learning community, so that the container of the workshop are the elements around standards for professional learning, of which there are 7. And of course, the first one is the professional learning community. So that's the container in which I do the workshops around reading and reading workshops and building a reading brain. So in terms of, even as a beginning teacher, a first-year teacher, 2nd grade in the hills, rural, outside of a mill town, I had a child that I simply wasn't able to reach. And I reached out to an experienced 2nd grade teacher to help me see and understand what was going on. And I was able to actually make a difference in that child's life, even as a first-year teacher, because I was willing to know my own limits and go to someone with more experience. And that's the power of a professional learning community, where you have so much expertise in a school, and we're able to learn how to respectfully tap that knowledge and share that knowledge.
Absolutely. Jean, I love that example. And I guess we're, as we wind this topic up, and there's so much more, I mean, this is a series of workshops in and of itself to cover the topic of comprehension. So we hope our listeners are hearing and considering things that maybe they didn't know, or it highlights something that they had forgotten. But one thing that stands out for me, that Margaret Rawson, really the matriarch of the International Dyslexia Association and the founder of this Margaret Bird Rawson Institute, she would always say this, and it came to mind as you were speaking. She would say, Teresa, it's not about training. It's not, a teacher isn't like a dog to be trained. They're to be educated. This is about education. And what you were just saying made me think, a well-educated teacher, or even a well-educated and informed parent, understands that if something's not working for a child, it's not that they have to impose their tools or trainings. They have to step back and be fully educated to realize, is this a neurological issue, a vision issue, a hearing issue, an emotional issue, a speech language issue? Like, really be fully educated and be comfortable going to a peer or a doctor, going somewhere to try to assess what this could be, even if you get the wrong answer, like I did with my son. They said, oh, his speech language is fine when we went to child find, but and it wasn't. I had to keep pursuing. So to be fully educated is to be fully informed of the potentials of what could be going on, and try to assess like a detective would. Yes. And problem solve. We're all being detectives in how to help a child crack that reading code to get meaning. And that's what we're here. We're here for each other. And it's that connectedness by sharing and talking and listening and learning and being open to something you haven't even considered that may help that particular child, because we're so unique. We're each different. Every human brain is not the same. It's wired differently, and our job is to kind of crack the code of that particular brain, right? While we're trying to crack the reading code, so to speak.
Well, we're trying to, instead of focusing on what he can't do, go back to how I started. What can he do? And if you go back and begin to record what he is able to do, you will come forward to the point where it begins to break down. Instead of starting with what he can't do and backing up, he can't do this, can't do this, can't do this, start with what he can do and go up to the forward. And then you'll find the weakest link. and you reinforce that, then he can do that and then build it that way.
That's beautiful, Jean. And so, I just want to thank you for sharing your time with our listeners and your years of experience. It's so valuable. And in closing, I just want to thank our listeners for being a part of this important webinar series. Please send this webinar link to your friends and family and coworkers, your school community members. The more people who know about the necessary keys to unlocking educational success for reading, the better. And this will help us to work together to transform our educational systems for the better. Help us to get the word out, take care, and be sure to send us any questions that you may have. You can go to info at transforming.education and send questions our way, and we look forward to hearing from you. Thank you, Jean, and thank you to our listeners. Thank you.